Welcome to Book Talks with Colors of Influence. I am your host, Maylene Hamto. I'm an avid reader and reviewer of books for my book blog, Colors of Influence, and I also review books for outlets and platforms such as City Books, Halo Hall Review, Book Sirens, Read See, and the Nonfiction Authors Association. So Book Talks focuses on fiction and nonfiction works that highlight issues of diverse identities, equity and inclusion, social justice, Indigenous ways of beings, and decolonial approaches to the struggle for liberation. So I talk to authors whose works contribute to a nuanced understanding of various cross-cultural contexts of our shared humanity and common dreams. And for this conversation, it is an honor to host the Reverend Terry J Stokes, author of Jesus and the Abolitionists: How Anarchist Christianity Empowers the People. It is a book that introduces readers to the ancient practice of anarchy and how it intersects with Christian beliefs and values. So Reverend Stokes holds degrees from Yale University and Princeton Theological Seminary and was ordained as a minister of Word and Sacrament by Park Avenue Baptist Church, an abolitionist congregation on Muskogee land in Atlanta, Georgia. He lives on Muncie Lenape land in central New Jersey, where he works with children and youth as a nonprofit director. And so in his book, Reverend Stokes challenges the common definitions of anarchy, which are often conflated with chaos, with violence and disorder. So he challenges us to a deeper read of the political philosophy of anarchy and argues that anarchy has the potential to empower small communities of people to take care of their own needs at the local level, making the state obsolete. And so Reverend Stokes, or Terry, writes that at its most foundational level, anarchy is about putting people above profit and ensuring that we all flourish in systems that are built on ethics of justice and equality. So I had the wonderful opportunity to review Jesus and the Abolitionists for City Books, which you can read the review by visiting the link in the description of this YouTube channel. But I also wanted to share briefly some excerpts from other reviewers. So this is from Marquis Bay, a professor at Northwestern University and author of Anarcho-Blackness, where he says, "This is a book at once of love and radicality. Stokes offers a unique voice into the ways Christianity and the teachings of Jesus necessitate an anarchist worldview. There is a forthright demand via Christian ethic of love to renounce the violence and domination of the state, while simultaneously creating something more loving, more caring." And from Melissa Flora Bixler, pastor of Raleigh Mennonite Church, Stokes introduces readers to political life beyond coercion and to a faith outside the reaches of violence, weaving together political theory, scriptural insight, and theological rigor. Stokes's accessible book is a gift to anyone who has looked at a world devastated by statecraft and wondered, is there another way? And then finally, from Amar D. Peterman, founder of the Scholarship for Religion and Society, he had this to say: Jesus and the Abolitionists offers a practical, systematic theology for Christians who seek to live generously, lovingly, and compassionately in a world marked by division. Stokes's call is wonderfully local, drawing the reader to serve their neighbor. This anarchic vision is one of building, not burning, of asking hard questions, while also proposing how we might live with Christ-like communal focus on God's redemptive work. Thank you so much, Reverend Terry J. Stokes, and thank you for joining Book Talks.
It's my pleasure and my honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Appreciate your time. And let's jump right in. If you could give us a little bit of background about what inspired you to write this book.
Absolutely. Yeah, I finished my Master of Divinity studies at Princeton Seminary in 2020. We went on spring break, and then the shutdown happened, and they told us, okay, take another week of spring break, and then we'll figure out what to do from there. And so we ended up doing the last half of that semester online. And so as everything was shut down, I had so much extra time on my hands to sort of continue this process of theological reconstruction that had begun a couple of years earlier when I had entered really the first progressive space I'd ever been a part of. And so after a couple of years of really kind of breaking down and building back up my worldview, especially around questions of gender, sexuality, doctrine of scripture or scriptural interpretation, now 2020 became this time to move into exploring how my faith could intersect with social justice and race. And so that was spurred along by what was going on in the country at the time, that particular iteration of the Black liberation movement and Black Lives Matter movements, and particularly the murder of George Floyd. That became an opportunity for me to channel my isolated rage into reading and studying. And so around that time, Verso Books made a title called The End of Policing free to download. And so it was really timely that they did that, because a lot of people were more curious than they had been previously. And there was a lot more openness to those kinds of worldviews than there had been. And so I was one of those people that began to read literature on police abolition, prison abolition. And the more that I read, I just kind of thought more and more, oh, this is a philosophy that allows me to actually follow the teachings of Jesus. Whereas previously in my Christian upbringing, it had always felt like the things that Jesus was saying, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, the way that the early church, the early Christian community is described in the book of Acts, that all felt like, oh, that's aspirational and it's symbolic, and that's not actually meant to be lived out in real life because of uh, total depravity, because of original sin. We can't actually achieve that kind of way of living together. But as I read the autobiography of Angela Davis and Mutual Aid by Dean Spade and all this literature that was helping me to explore leftism and communism, socialism, and then eventually anarchism, it came it came to present itself as a way of thinking and a way of relating to one another that actually allowed me to turn the other cheek, to carry the packet the extra mile, to give my cloak as well, to seek ye first the kingdom of God. All these things that had seemed impossible within the overall theology that I had been given and trained in growing up. So that was really exciting to me during that year of 2020. And my colleagues at the church I was working at the time supported me in that journey. I was working at a church that was very progressive and had a lot of not only really positive messaging around issues of social justice, but also was very active in the community in terms of refugee resettlement, reentry into society after incarceration, work with unaccompanied minors, so on and so forth. And so that was sort of an incubator for me and for many others to not just read about the kind of intersection of these things, but also begin to see how they work out practically. And so, yeah, by the end of 2022, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine that I met through that church, and just mentioned, yeah, I just read this awesome book called Mutual Aid. Really excited about the things I'm learning. And she said, oh yeah, a lot of my anarchist friends, like mutual aid is kind of their whole thing. And I was like, ooh, anarchism. That's kind of like the boogeyman word that I have heard offhand, but have never seriously encountered as an actual philosophy. And so, yeah, that was sort of like the last stop on the train for me of beginning to jump into thinkers like Murray Bookchin and coming to this culmination of this process, like I mentioned earlier, of seeing how to actually follow the teachings of Jesus and how to build a politic that supports that and makes it possible. So over the last 5 days of 2022, I wrote a 120-page first draft of this book. It was just kind of all spilling out of me, just kind of coming out of all of the notes that I had been taking as I've been reading all these books. It almost felt like I was channeling it rather than sort of contriving it. And thankfully, I already had an agent from a former project that I put out, and so it was very much a departure from my first project, but I sent it on to my agent anyways to see what she would think of it. She ended up being on board with it. We ended up reaching out to publishers, and before long, it became a real project that was going to be published in the world.
Wonderful. And thank you for sharing that context and sort of the process and the journey that you had, that you took to make this a reality. And what a beautiful and just a really it's not challenging in a way that it's hard to read, but it really challenges many people in the Christian faith to really look at their beliefs and how they can embody the true scripture, the true teachings, right? So thank you for that. And I also just wanted to mention, so the book focuses on integrating anarchist ethics, and we'll talk more about the language, right? You alluded to it earlier, but in this book, you focused on integrating anarchist ethics into the practice of Christianity, right? And so, if you could walk us through a little bit about the main components of anarchist Christianity and why are they critical during these times?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I sort of alluded earlier to the Sermon on the Mount being a a central locus of biblical teachings from which this anarchist ethic finds reinforcement, whether you're coming to it as an anarchist who maybe doesn't have a religious background or as a Christian who doesn't have a background in leftist politics or whatever it may be. But when you encounter these teachings that, taken in their sum in my reading, account to a non-coercive, um, generous, solidarity economy and sort of way of relating to one another, where you don't swear allegiances to any ruling bodies or rulers, right? Swear no oath of any kind. You don't return evil for evil, judge not lest ye be judged. So that cuts out any kind of court system, that cuts out policing, that cuts out prisons, that cuts out so many of the things that we take as so much for granted as the only way to repair harm. And then all of the "you have heard it said, but I say unto you" statements of the Sermon on the Mount also seem to basically amount to, you have taken it for granted that you have to live this way of competition, scarcity, returning evil for evil. But I say unto you, there is a different way to repair harm, to get the things that you need, to live in harmony with the people around you, to be safe, right? All these things that we think we can only achieve through coercion of some kind and domination, rulership. But Jesus, in those short 3 chapters or so, is laying out the basis for another whole entire politic and economy. And so when I first started kind of making those connections in my mind, I had the choice of sort of going the more like academic route of like trying to go and read everything that's ever been written on Christian anarchism, your Leo Tolstoy's and everything, and try to go get a PhD in Christian anarchism and then like find the little nugget that I could add to the puzzle and publish a dissertation. Or just kind of take the approach of, I'm not going to try to create a composite. I'm not going to try to become an expert on this field. I'm going to just channel these original realizations and connections that I'm making. And of course, original, not in the sense that no one has ever thought of them before, but just original for me because it's new for me. Because the literature I like to read is written in an accessible, popular tone. It's not coming from a place of just summarizing what all else has been said and then adding a little piece. It's a deeply personal, product that's integrating every aspect of that person's life. And so that was why anarchist Christianity as opposed to Christian anarchism was important as a order of modifiers for me, because I wanted to write in such a way where a Christian that, like perhaps similarly to me, had only heard the term anarchism in this sort of like negative boogeyman monster under the bed kind of context, and actually encounter it as something that is arising purely out of the central text, Jesus's greatest hits, so to speak, as I like to always call them. Or you could also encounter what I'm writing, hopefully, as someone who's not from a religious background, but is deeply invested in whether it be leftism, socialism, communism, or anarchism, and to see, oh, like the things that Jesus taught, while they've been betrayed by the institutional church, I can actually find a lot of resonance with what I already believe and with what is being represented to be and repackaged to me. And so, yeah, those are some of the kind of the main tenets of my journey into Christian anarchism, really just coming back to, what if we had an economy and a decision-making process that was based on a belief that we can be just as geared towards or trained in solidarity, mutual aid, and generosity as we have been in competition, scarcity, and domination.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And uh you alluded to sort of the boogeyman, right?
Mhm.
And how anarchism is, basically conflated with a lot of negativity. And so, and words are important. And so in this
Mhm.
day and age, especially, words like, radicalism, abolition, anarchism carry with them a certain connotation. And how do you make sure that people are engaged in the conversation? And you talked about this a little bit, but if you could kind of expand on that a little bit. So how do you make sure that people are engaged in the conversation despite their discomfort with these terms? Mhm.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And when I was writing the book, I felt a tension between, on one hand, using a stark term like anarchism to sort of set myself apart from the wider body of more progressive literature and ideas that are out there, which can sometimes, at least for me, be so busy that it's overwhelming and I don't know exactly where to look. But then on the other hand, sort of like you alluded to, not being so set on any particular term or semantics that I exclude people who would otherwise maybe listen for a minute or two longer, who might just even involuntarily shut down when they hear a certain term based off of their experience with that particular term. So, I mean, I definitely have encountered people who, when they hear the word anarchism, they think of I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Leon C. His last name starts with a C. He the man who assassinated President McKinley. Actually, my one of my parents falls in that category, and I also have people for whom hearing that term is kind of like a breath of fresh air, like, oh, like sort of like how I encountered it, like, oh, that's I'm excited by the possibility of that being something substantive and robust rather than just like a buzzword. So I think that in my own work, writing and speaking, I've sort of tried to navigate knowing that there are people who fit into both of those categories. And so, you read the review by Marquise Bay, professor at Northwestern. In their book, Anarcho Blackness, they have a section where they talk a little bit about how, for them, it's not about identifying. It's not the goal is not to proselytize anarchism or to convert people to where they identify as this or that. If someone is doing anarchic work, that's the most important thing. And so in the last chapter of my book, that's sort of the approach I take as well, to kind of point out, you may not think of yourself as a radical or an anarchist, but you might be participating in work that has an anarchic bent to it. One of the examples I bring up is restorative justice work. If you are directing people away from the penal system into this structure where they have the ability to find deep understanding, to repair harm in a non-dominative way, um, that that is just as anarchic as anything that Peter Kropotkin or Lucy Parsons, these more well-known, more specifically identified people are doing or have done. Um, and so that's a big piece of my mindset as well. Just trying to be clear about who I am and trying to maintain a somewhat clear definition of anarchism so that it doesn't become a meaningless term. But then on the other hand, just remembering and keeping in mind that ultimately, like, my goal is not to make people anarchists. My goal is to encourage people to find ways to live more in solidarity, more according to mutual aid. And those are ideas that a lot of people want. I have found that a lot of people don't think that it's possible. They think that mutual aid, solidarity, generosity would be great ways to organize our economies and our politics, but they have conceded that there are certain areas where those things aren't accessible. And so I think a big part of my work is just opening folks' eyes up to small ways in which those concessions don't need to be made, and that those spaces in our lives can be reclaimed for the values that a lot of us already hold higher than the values that we concede to.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Terry. And I really appreciate the careful intentionality that you provided in, offering the context, about the terminology that was used, as well as making sure that, people feel included in the conversation, right? Like one of the reviews mentioned how this book was very accessible. So you talked earlier about how it would it is applicable to Christians who are looking, at different ways of kind of, solving our issues or interacting with others, as well as perhaps people who are, more of a progressive anarchic bent would also find that, there is room in Christianity for, the ideas that are around. And so and I wanted to give for this next question, I just wanted to give a bit of a context and share a little bit of background about my own positionality, which was important as I read the book, right? So I grew up Christian in the Philippines, predominantly Catholic. And so I'm aware that, Christianity came to the islands as a result of colonization and was propped up by empire. So a lot of what you had, written about regarding, the states and all that, nation states, was very, relevant and resonant for me. So and of course, there is also an inherent threat of white supremacy in the way that my people came upon Christianity. And on the other hand, my folks have also found a lot of solace in the biblical stories of resistance. And so I know you talked about this earlier, but wondering how you might, answer the question of how can Christians today draw upon the spirit of radicalism that
Yeah.
characterized Jesus and his teachings?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Decolonization or decolonial are terms that I think are gaining more acceptance in progressive conversations. And whenever I hear those terms, I think to myself, how can you decolonize something without also having an anarchist ethos, at least, if not intent? Because if a country has colonization baked into its very DNA, how can you realistically be decolonizing that project without also having this mindset of we have to abolish this. Yeah, basically, how can you achieve what you want to without abolishing the thing that is inherently colonist, colonizing? Um, and so when I look at whether it be diasporic people groups like my own or nations that have recently gone through or are currently going through decolonizing efforts, national liberation efforts, I think what anarchism and Christianity have to offer to that is a way out of the process that has happened so many times, which is we have kicked out our colonizers, but we have become them because we have created our own nation state according to the same logic, according to the same patterns. And now we find ourselves in a situation that isn't much better. It's just the people that are oppressing us look like us as opposed to before, where that, it wasn't the case. And so I think that for me, that's one of the most valuable assets that anarchism brings to the table, is sort of breaking this cycle of revolution and recapitulation that we see going back throughout history. I mean, the French Revolution comes to mind as something that is heralded, and of course, rightly so, as such a progressive world world altering event. And yet, because of sort of the underlying status logic that goes into it, you end up with something that is not really that much more liberating than what you had before, in terms of you still have these structures that undergird capitalism, poverty, scarcity, and the removal of people from agency over their lives. Um, so when I think about my own context as someone from the African diaspora, someone who uh, lives and works in a predominantly Black and brown city, who is involved in a Black church, I think about the the beauty of how my community has reclaimed Christianity from the clutches of rulership, the clutches of accumulation. My pastor was saying it just this past Sunday, how they the dominating cultural group has made Christianity serve whatever was their leading ideology at the time. If it was slavery, Christianity supported it. If it was Jim Crow, Christianity supported it. So I find so much beauty in how my community, perhaps communities like yours, have reclaimed, have repackaged Christianity, reinterpreted the Bible in a more liberating way. And I think what I see anarchist Christianity adding to that already rich historical tapestry is taking it that next step further and saying, but we don't have to stop just at Black faces in high places as like our mountaintop. We don't have to just stop at wondering why we're in this continuous cycle of stepping back and stepping forward and stepping back, stepping forward, stepping back, and not seeming to get anywhere. Um, and so that's especially where Black anarchist thought comes into play for me. Folks like Marquise Bay, William C. Anderson, Lucy Parsons, and, whether it be 10 years ago or 100 years ago, already see how it is easy for those oppressed groups who have reclaimed Christianity to not see how to take that next step to the kind of liberation that Jesus offers. And so that's sort of what I try to do, even in my own space in a Black church where most folks are more liberal, electorally minded. There's not as many people who come from a perspective like mine, and yet there's so many folks who are open to doing a read through, a discussion group on my book, hearing in sermons, the things that are coming from my perspective, and so that just gives me hope that we can continue to move the needle on those things.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, decoloniality and abolition, breaking the cycle, right? Abolishing the systems and structures that are in place. And you brought up, for me, a question is like, what do we replace it with once we break everything down, right? And so your book really talks about the importance of, understanding that mutual aid, collaboration over competitiveness, really recognizing abundance versus scarcity, and really challenging the reader about the status quo beliefs about the role of the state in our lives. So appreciate that. And that leads me to my next question, which is what was the most challenging part or aspect of writing this book?
Mhm. I think the most challenging part did not have anything to do with the actual writing or editing of the book, but rather sort of shifts in my perspective and orientation towards the project. A couple of months into 2023, I went through some major upheavals in my life, career change, a move, um, leaving on bad terms, and I also at the same time had some health challenges that sort of came up out of nowhere. Discovered, well, let me tell it in order. So I was experiencing some migraines, thought it was maybe long COVID. Got to the point where I could barely function. Went to the hospital. They sent me home. Went to the hospital again, and they found a tumor in my brain. They said it was benign. They immediately operated on it. Operation was a success. I recovered. I went home. Unfortunately, the medication that they put me on for the inflammation from the incision put me into a state of psychosis, basically, like a manic state. And so I'm having my first panic attack of my life. I'm completely overwhelmed, not understanding what's happening to my mind. I go back to the hospital for another 5 days to try to get that settled out. And then all of this like personal career stuff is happening around the same time. And so my first reaction as the dust is sort of clearing from all of that is to sort of cling to anarchism as this like last shred of identity that has survived the storm. And so I like put out 30 episodes of a podcast about anarchist Christianity within a couple of weeks. I'm writing essays at all hours of the night, in sort of this manic state, or at least kind of receding from that. Um, and sort of clinging to that in the absence of the things that I had identified with before that were kind of now very unceremoniously removed. And then after a couple of months of that, these like fumes that I'd been running on with these sort of like anarchist identity sort of ran out to the point where now I associated all of this recent excitement, all of this writing, this project with all of that turmoil and trauma and grief. And so that was a stretch where it was really hard for me to engage with the project, engage with the editing rounds of the book, and to continue to find liberation and hope in something that was so deeply intertwined with these memories that I wanted to move on from and chapters that I wanted to turn the page from. And it wasn't really until the turn of 2024 that thankfully through a lot of therapy and a lot of prayer, and a lot of grace from loved ones, that I was able to reinterpret the events that had led to the upheaval in and move away from bitterness and shame, move into compassion and acceptance towards myself, towards others, and turn a new page in terms of what role anarchism was going to play in my own life going forward. And this was around the time that we were gearing up to kind of promote the publication of the book. And so I remember it being extremely difficult for me to even think about going on Instagram to post something about the book, or to like send an email to someone asking if they would be part of the launch team for the book, just because I was trying to move on from those memories, and it just was immediately bringing them back. But the church that ordained me, actually, the way that that happened was one of the pastors of that church had started listening to that podcast that I mentioned earlier, because I'd had on as a guest someone who was connected with that church. And so we that person reached out to me about the podcast. We talked a little bit. This was summer 2023. And then in 2024, when I was thinking about folks that I wanted to be part of the launch team to promote the book, I thought of this person, and I kind of like forced myself to send out the email, even though I didn't want to do any promotion, didn't want to kind of um, re-enter that mind space. But the way that they were so graciously excited about promoting the book, the way that they introduced me to other pastors at the church, sort of just like got the ball rolling just the tiniest bit. And then that led to me having a launch party at a really awesome anarchist bookstore not too far away from me that I didn't know about, and them being super receptive of the book, even though anarchist spaces can sometimes be very anti-religious for good reason. And so all of it just led to a lot of acceptance, a lot of welcome into spaces that made me feel like, oh, I can reclaim this, I can re-enter this, I can have something to say. And maybe the fact that I'm no longer in sort of the honeymoon phase of as an anarchist, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe the fact that I'm coming to it now after all of this and still believing in it, still finding hope in it, is sort of like, a couple that's been married 20 years and like, still finds ways to express their love, to keep things fresh. So yeah, that was definitely the most challenging, but also the most rewarding part of the journey.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that backstory, and really what you shared embodied how you dealt with, with grief and loss, and really kind of finding identity in anarchy, and glad that everything turned out well in the end,
Thank
and
you.
now we have this book that is really continuing to be a gift for many of us that are kind of trying to find our way. It's been challenging, but perhaps recent developments have made it a little bit more challenging in the social political climate,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
so definitely something to that, yeah, should all revisit and read. And now I'm getting to, my favorite part of these interviews, which is asking you, the author, to read an excerpt from the book that you think represents uh, an important lesson for readers, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I'm just going to read the epilogue of the book, which I think distills some of the key ideas in a nice way. So this is starting on page 169. The state, that is, the professionalization and centralization of rulership, is made by the bourgeoisie and for the bourgeoisie. It wasn't made for us. The fact that it doesn't serve us means it's working exactly as designed. If we want to build a society that's designed for us, we have to abolish the state and replace it with something that can be built by and for us. We need humanly scaled, communally administered towns and cities in which all participate and all collectively oversee every aspect of civic life, and from which we can support and interact with other cities in a commune of communes. There's nothing that logically or inherently prevents us from doing this. Not some presumed total depravity, not any presumed need for coercion or monopolized violence. In fact, far from precluding anarchy, logic demands it. Christianity, as I've argued, demands it. Our humanity demands it. The structures of violence, dominion, and death are arrayed against it, but the nature of God and the nature of their creation are for it and cannot ultimately be denied. Let's acknowledge and celebrate these deeper realities now and start to live in ways that increasingly reflect them. In 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois published Black Reconstruction, a systematic socialist reinterpretation of not only a historical event, but also of much of the cultural tradition that led to it and that which followed from it. It's long as heck, but it's rad. Everyone thought the story was settled, but Du Bois decided to take his training, his experience, and his perspective, as well as the voices of his ancestors and his community, into account in order to take another look. And even though social studies textbooks and college level history syllabi to this day still regurgitate the narratives Du Bois sought to subvert, a fuller understanding is there for those who are looking for it. I hope for this book to be a systematic anarchist reinterpretation of not only the historical events of Jesus Christ, but also much of the cultural and spiritual tradition that set the stage for it and that which followed from it. I tried to replace Du Bois's long encyclopedic lists of facts, figures, and names with jokes, and I tried to shave off 600 pages, but ultimately I hoped to accomplish something similar. Many think the story of Christianity is settled, but is full of homies who knew that it certainly was not. I'm here to stand on their shoulders. I'm used to this. I'm too short to be able to see at concerts, and honor them by building on what they did, just as I hope generations after me do with my work. And the cool thing is, I don't need to take down the dominant narrative. All I hope to do is hasten its obsolescence. This book is one person's anarchist theological system. As I mentioned, these are theological and political opinions supported by evidence whose selection is very ideologically motivated. But I think I make a pretty solid case. The way I see it, Christianity is anarchic, and so are its implications for what we believe about God, humanity, interaction between God and humanity, the Bible, church history, church administration, ethics, the end of this world, and the beginning of the next.
Hmm. Wow. Thank you so much, Terry, for reading that portion and writing it. It's truth and this vision for, moving away from coercion, from violence. You really present us with the possibilities of how we can all move together in ways that uplift and uphold our shared humanities. And we have so much to learn from you, from your journey through the Black liberation movement. Intellectuals and theologians like yourself really model for me and other brown and other people from indigenous communities how to be here and how to be present for each other. So, and I'm coming up to my last question, which is, can you share with us some of the most surprising feedback you've received about the book?
Yeah. It's been really neat to do like a little mini tour in support of the book. Last year, we did the initial launch at the Wooden Shoe in Philly. We did so actually the night before my ordination, we did a book talk at that same church in Atlanta, Park Avenue, and then they connected me with a church in Charlotte. It's part of their same network of churches, so we did a book talk there and then finished it off with Red Emma's, which is a really awesome anarchist bookstore in Baltimore. Um, but through all of that, I think actually it wasn't the most surprising feedback wasn't any of the questions or comments I got at any of those events. But I think it was how the book actually offered me the opportunity to reconnect with a friend of mine from high school. Well, actually from elementary school on through high school, from my hometown and the church that we went to growing up, which was a Southern Baptist church. And this friend of mine uh, sort of followed the path that quite a few of my friends from high school followed. I grew up in Hampton, Virginia, a fairly heavily military area due to the shipyard in Norfolk, the military base, Langley Air Force Base, near closer to where I grew up. And so I think both because of how many people come from that background, as well as just the way in which the like recruiters are kind of the primary people you see in the high schools offering you something, not only something to do after high school, but also a way to pay for it. And a lot of these folks are coming from a background where they don't see any other way to pay for college, to kind of break out of generational cycles of poverty, or just kind of mobile or non-mobile stagnation, social economic stagnation. A lot of people will take that ticket. And so this friend of mine was one of those folks. Kind of was accepted to college, was excited, didn't know how he was going to pay for it, ended up joining the military. And um, when I was writing sections in the book that were critical of the military, I had not only friends like him in mind, also a lot of my family members who are decorated members of the Air Force. My grandfather was a second generation Tuskegee Airman. And so like always wanting to maintain that respect for the people who perhaps not having any other option went and served, but also trying to be very clear that I am very against the idea of war, having a standing military, and the way in which governments will force people into poverty and then force them into the military, into the police as offering it as a way to escape poverty. So trying to maintain that tension. And so all of that is in my mind when I'm writing. And so when I heard from this friend of mine who took that path, and for him to say that the book was a shot in the arm for his faith, was sort of reinvigorating his enthusiasm for a faith that had become such a challenge over recent years for several reasons. One being sort of the recapitulation of evangelicalism, white evangelicalism, as well as just coming to a point in our life, in his life, that many people come to, which is, okay, how do I reinterpret this faith to make it make sense for this part of my life and this part of my journey. So to hear from him that it was such a blessing to him, that it was giving him so much life, helping him to believe and find faith once again, was deeply moving. And I think that's been one of the most gratifying forms of feedback that I've gotten so far.